Hello! Welcome to Impersonal Opinion, the podcast where we don't take our opinions personally. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega, and I had a few questions to ask him regarding the difference between pantheism and accutheism, because he defined as a pantheist for a long time, but then later introduced this new word, accutheist. And maybe, George, you could just start out by explaining what the slight difference there is, if any.
All right, yeah, and I'm not sure they're kind of like variations of the same concept in a way, different ways of saying the same thing. Um, Pantheists basically believe that the universe and God are synonymous. It really is no more complicated than that. An acutheist um, also defends God, but just like is not completely pleased with the traditional definition of God. For example, God is often defined as transcending reality. So like to my mind, that makes no sense. I think that's conceptually impossible. Because outside of reality would be another part of reality. So basically, you're right, Chandler. It is there are kind of like different ways of saying the same thing. But the other thing is like pantheism comes with a bit of baggage. Spinoza kind of promoted his brand of pantheism that actually believed in a benevolent God, an omnibenevolent God, all good. I'm not sure I could see that. Uh, Einstein was also a pantheist, but he rejected the notion of a personal God, where for me, a personal God is simply personifying God rather than seeing the universe as a thing. So I guess, yeah, but essentially it's like the idea of like, an acutheist defends God, but defends an accurate definition of God rather than like many that are just like wrong in various ways.
Yeah. See, what's interesting about it is one of the problems with all labels that I've noticed is that there will be many different people who use a label, whether that's Christian, atheist, pantheist, Jew, Muslim. They're all using the same label, but they believe slightly different things. And so this is where it's tricky. So no matter what label someone uses, it's difficult. Um, because now what you're saying is that you like to personify the universe basically rather than just seeing it as a thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not arbitrary. I kind of like have to see it as personified because understanding we don't have a free will means that our consciousness is really not our own. It really belongs to the universe. Just like the consciousness like that controls a puppet doesn't really belong to the puppet, it belongs to the puppeteer. So it's difficult for me to assign consciousness to to a thing. It's more difficult. I mean, it seems more correct to just define to assign consciousness to a being, rather than a thing. And so, like a being is just like the personification of a thing, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of interesting because what it gets down to is for me, a person is or a life form is really just a conscious thing. It's still a thing, but it's conscious, and that's what makes it cool. So here's the thing. I think that it is a relevant thing for people to discuss pantheistic ideas because it's often overlooked. In fact, I was listening to the audiobook of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, and he did quite a large section about Einstein and pantheism. It was kind of interesting, but yes, it did include the quote that Einstein didn't believe in a personal God, and it's kind of interesting because now, while I like pantheism better than, the traditional beliefs, it's kind of it's hard to see. I guess I'm still not sure about the reason for why use the word God instead of universe. As you know, some of the other co-hosts think the same as that.
Okay, there's several reasons. The first, I think, just kind of like historically, the term God, I think, preceded universe. You know, in other words, like people were using God to refer to everything that is and what governs everything, and then the creator of everything, even, before, we came up with the word universe. So it seems more consistent in that way. The second is that I believe that there is more to human beings, more to reality than we can physically know with our um, instrumentation, current understanding. I believe there's a quote unquote spiritual dimension, not dimension, but just like there are aspects of reality that I'm a materialist. I believe everything is physical, but there are aspects of reality that lie beyond our ability to at least reliably, empirically, you know, access or perceive, and and so yeah, the designation God, I think, is more in line with this kind of spiritual dimension of human beings and this spiritual aspect of reality that than would be just like that the universe simply exists. Because with the universe simply existing, it just leaves some open questions, like um, what's the nature of what created the Big Bang? I mean, was it random? I can't believe it was random, because random means without a cause, and that seems like a non-starter. And if it wasn't random, to my mind, there must have been order. There must have been some kind of process, some kind of plan, and that suggests, kind of like a God-like consciousness.
Yeah, you said some important things there, George, because this comes up when people have their arguments for and against the existence of God. One of the particular cases is that of the infinite regress, because people, they look at complexity around them and they think, well, it must have been designed by some creator. But then it always begs the question of, well, who created the creator? Because the idea is that if you need some complex creator that to explain the complexity you see, well, then that creator is so complex that it needs a creator. So that what's interesting about it is, due to this reasoning over that, I've thought about that for a long time, was the infinite creator regress, even before I got involved in determinism and free will and all this stuff. Um, and that was how I came to the conclusion that something had to eternally exist, no beginning, just always was there, because that's the only thing that makes sense, especially if we're to hold to the conservation of mass energy, that matter is neither created nor destroyed.
Exactly, Chandler, and that's why I would say it's really, inaccurate to say that God doesn't quote unquote exist, because, for example, if we take the wiki page on God, one of his attributes is well, omnipresence. Does it have eternal? Um, I don't know. One of the attributes of God, I think, is that God is eternal. It has eternal. Before creation and after God exists, whatever. Well, I mean that's the same kind of like definition of an eternal universe. So yeah, this concept of eternity as it applies to God, it just similarly applies to the universe.
Yeah, in fact, I think that's the most interesting of the well known attributes of God. I believe that is commonly an attribute given to God, as being eternal. And here's where it gets a little bit tricky, because there are debates with people over. Some people believe that the universe is 6,000 years old, and or at least that the Earth is, and then others are saying that it's like 13.7 something billion years old, and that it started with the Big Bang somehow. But there's always whatever, no matter what somebody tries to do, they're trying to assume that there is a beginning when it doesn't really make that much sense for there to be a beginning. And as soon as somebody tries to suggest that there is a beginning to all things, then all of a sudden that means that there has to be a beginning to their God, whichever God they believe in.
Yeah, in Chandler, we can draw a distinction between kind of like a theological understanding of, let's say, the creation, which, is, you know, in naturalistically, the creation is 13.8 billion years old, and what created the creation, and theologically, um, between a big bang, and again the known universe and the universe beyond the big bang. So they're both, in both instances, you arrive at the same conclusion that yes, there's a creation that we can observe as having started from the Big Bang, but then there's a more eternal aspect of the creation that we can either define eternally as God or eternally as the universe.
Yeah, I think it gets down to some definitions because, see, here's was how I came to define myself as atheist is because um I grew up Christian, and God was a person that got mad at humans for disobeying him and then sending them to hell, and all that kind of crazy stuff. Um, and here's what it amounts to is that it amounts to believe in that type of God. It requires that God be a free will believer and blame his creation for how he designed them. And that's why, because and then the only we would have to, by that type of God that they promote, we would have to say that God would be an extremely unintelligent not to understand that free will is impossible for humans to possess.
Yeah, you're right. So there's certain attributes attributed to God that don't seem to make sense, like omnibenevolence. If God made the entire universe, clearly God made both goodness and evil, pain and pleasure and all. It just doesn't make sense to see God as perfect goodness, because, like, then you'd have to explain, where did evil come from? And naturally, we know you can't explain it through free will because, like, well, it doesn't exist. Um, so, then, in terms of, um, let's see. Okay, so that's the reason for the phrase accutheist. In other words, there are certain aspects of God, certain definitions of God that are accurate, when we keep them, but then there are certain definitions that aren't, and those we discard. Um, for example, in theology, an accutheist, I think, would discard prophetic religion, meaning that, like, because somebody a few thousand years ago said that something is so, we hold it to be true, as opposed to saying, well, because something makes sense, something has evidence for it, we hold it to be true. So that's one criterion. And so, like, you could apply this to the universe. For example, there's an accurate and inaccurate view of the universe. It used to be, until not so long ago, the standard understanding in physics of the nature of the universe was what was known as the steady state. that all these like stars and galaxies were like interspersed, just the way they are now. Then we learned about this Big Bang. So we learned that actually, 13.7 point, 13.8 billion years ago, the universe was condensed to the size of like smaller than an atom. So, so again, just as we can like arrive in more and more accurate understandings of God or theology, we can, or we do arrive at more and more accurate understandings of the universe, but we don't throw the universe out. We don't say, well, the universe didn't exist while they believed in the steady state. We just say, well, they got some of it wrong, they got some of it right.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting because now, while I'm still not sure if I don't think I believe the Big Bang, basically. And I even recently listened to an interview with, I think it was an astrophysicist or something like that, and he was trying to explain the Big Bang. And just like every other time that I've listened to something about it, I didn't understand it at all. That's the way it goes when people talk about some of this science. It goes over my head. But what's interesting here is yeah, anyway, your larger point is that because uh, um, there were different opinions in the past about the universe, we don't say that the universe didn't exist back when people held that opinion. Similarly, like if they believed that the sun was spinning around the earth, we wouldn't say that the sun or earth didn't exist, but somebody was wrong about the order.
Well, exactly, and that's the point. So that's the value of being an acutheist. It points out the clear errors in theological reasoning without throwing everything out. Like, and as you're saying, it's the same thing in science. We science does that all the time.
Yeah, and well, here's what's interesting about it, George. Now, because when people talk about something existing, I guess it's a little bit complicated because, in one sense, for example, humans like us are changing all the time. I could say that the Chandler that I was a few years ago doesn't exist anymore because I've changed so much. Everything about, my whole diet, my whole belief system, everything's changed. So then somebody could question, well, does Chandler exist? And if Chandler's defined as the Chandler, from 3 years ago, well, then no, Chandler does not exist. But rather, it would make more sense to say Chandler has changed than it would be to say Chandler doesn't exist, right?
I agree with that. I think, that it would depend on different definitions of exist, but it's more commonsensical to say that, yeah, sure, we existed, 10 years ago, and we exist differently, today. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, like, for example, somebody doesn't necessarily need to believe that the universe always existed in the way it does now, but that it can change and evolve. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Right. I just wanted to get back to your point about the Big Bang. I mean, like, we talked about this before, and, you know, I mean, there is evidence that all of the galaxies are expanding, further and further away from each other, and that kind of like points to a much smaller universe, you know, many years ago. Where I really haven't researched this is like where they get to the point that it has to be, you know, infinitesimally. Sometimes I read small or like small in size of an atom. I mean, I don't understand why they have to go that far into smallness, why it couldn't exist, let's say, the size of, 10 dozen galaxies or something. I don't know. I don't know enough about it to understand how they come up with the size.
Yeah, see, that's why I don't believe it. Because when they do that and try to say that there was something the size of an atom or something really, really small like that, well, then they've lost me. Because if it was that small, then where did all the extra matter come from to make it big now?
Right, and that's where we refer to like the known or observable universe, you know, which is finite. It's limited by both its dimensions, as far as it is expanded and as old as it is, about 13.8 billion years, and the universe outside of that, or like the infinite universe that existed before it, and presumably, occupied that space that our known universe expanded into. Because then you create have another geometric problem with, well, what is it expanding into?
Yeah, and it gets very interesting because I think there's so much more to reality than what we could possibly ever know. In fact, there are some things we simply won't know. There's no amount of science that can that can really tell us what's going on inside the head of an earthworm, for example. You know, we don't really know what they're thinking. And there's obviously no way to travel in space to find out all that's there. So yeah, there are, what some people, they try to say that science will, eventually understand everything, and I don't think that's possible. But I think that in order to make sense of all the matter that we are having now, having expanded from some point, moving objects moving further away from each other, still would suggest that however they were compacted would still be very, very large. So I tend to take things that people say, even when it's scientists, I tend to not just take their word for it because, like you said, we don't want to just do things based on, well, because some guy said so.
You're right, Chandler. And considering that so many scientists still don't get that we don't have a free will and still don't understand, which is equally important, the significance of this knowledge. Some people say, like, fine, we have a free will, we don't have a free will, it doesn't matter. So, like, you have, like, so many scientists who are clueless in either one or both aspects of this question. That should tell you, yes, to reserve a lot of judgment in terms of, like in terms like you can't, for example, argue with a cell phone. I mean, like our engineers, they know what they're doing, or argue with like going to the moon and back and stuff. But understanding the fundamental nature of reality is a different set of skills that many, many scientists just simply don't have.
Yeah, and another thing that's interesting is that, well, I can never really know from one minute to the next whether all the things I'm believing are right. The only thing I'm really sure about is the impossibility of free will because there's no way to make it make sense. Um, and so it gets interesting because we sort of have an issue because people they don't agree on definitions of the word, and so it's kind of tricky. So when you talk about God and you're talking about the universe, and other people talk about God, and they mean something from one of the monotheist or polytheistic religions that are major world religions, well then they are talking about something that will reward or punish you in an afterlife based on freely chosen things. But since there are no freely chosen things for which we're responsible, their God, as defined by being a free will believer, can't exist. So then I think, George, what our issue is not does God exist or does not God not exist, but which gods exist.
Exactly. Or, I mean, like, I tend to be a monotheist, considering everything to be God, right? So there's just one God that's everything. But, what you just mentioned, we have the same problem in physics and astronomy. Like, you go to one person and they'll say, well, the universe you know, is the nature of the universe is that the past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. Where another version of the universe is like, well, no, the past existed in the past, the present in the present. So like, you have this problem of definitions, and certainly that is also a problem of knowledge. So in other words, like if you're going to be most accurate about like theistically, then I think any conception of more than one God would logically have to be subsumed within, the one overall God. You know, um, so it's really a matter of getting to the right definition among various proposed definitions.
Yeah, and here's one thing is, clearly there's a lack of ability to even agree on what the meaning is of terms that we're using. People, people are using the exact same words but meaning totally different things. And here's what this implies to me personally is that we're all just a bunch of basically confused life forms that that we don't know, because words in and of themselves are something that have developed, languages have developed over a long time. And so I guess we take words too seriously, but at the same time they're the best tool we have for communicating on Skype.
Oh yeah, and just imagine, however many thousands of years ago, before there were any words, you just have to like wonder how the human mind worked back then. Everything was images and sounds and some sensations with nothing being, you know, labeled, phonetically and all. It must be a very, very different way of thinking.
Well, absolutely. And there is only one type, one class of human beings that I can think that exists now who have not been exposed to, like spoken language anyway, and that's deaf people, because deaf people can't hear anything. So there's still words you could say, um, because they still can, read and write written language, but I imagine their perception of it is very different. I mean, and then there's sign language. Sign language is used to, use certain types of images where people make with their hands or various things to express certain ideas, and in some ways makes more sense than any of the spoken languages. So then we're faced with a thing such as how would one talk about the universe in sign language?
Yeah, no, I hear you. I hear you. I mean, obviously, like, since, you know, spoken language is symbolic and, sign language is graphically symbolic, I'm sure there's a way, but like, it's like mathematics. Mathematics is also like a symbolic language that's not necessarily, doesn't have to be auditory. One can know like numbers without knowing how to pronounce them and all. So, I guess, I don't know, it's an interesting question though, yeah.
Yeah, it's very curious because I mean, people over words, disagreements about words, they'll fight wars and kill each other over it. And, it helped if they didn't believe in free will and blame each other. But I guess our problem when communicating any idea, whether it's communicating about free will or communicating about any social or political or religious issue, we're stuck with using words for the most part to communicate with people. But I guess it just takes a lot of word to define what we mean by the words we use. And I'm just not plain sure anymore over what term to use. I've actually considered the idea that it's better to let our actions speak for us rather than saying, well, I'm a Hindu, I'm an atheist, or I'm a Republican, or I'm a Democrat, or you know what I mean? Just rather than using these labels, because as soon as someone hears the label, they're like, "Oh no, you're one of those people,"
Well, you're right, Chandler. Labels can be extremely divisive. I mean, they can be kind of like practical in certain ways. In other words, like if you want to like form a group of people that have similar beliefs, they might be either like progressive or conservative or Republican or Democrat or, a member of one religion. So it does have some practical purposes. But I remember listening to this guy on Pal Talk about maybe 10 years ago, and he would advocate for just not naming anything, for just like not seeing ourselves as people, not seeing ourselves as anything. It was a kind of like a very interesting and curious way of seeing reality, just seeing ourselves beneath all the labels we put on ourselves, beneath the label of man or woman or of all these kinds of like labels we have of what we do and all that. And so, yeah, it kind of like leads us to see ourselves in a more fundamental way.
Yeah. And while I think George, we're sort of forced to use these labels for certain things, When if you're taking a survey and it gives you multiple choice selections, then you have to select the label over or the answer which conforms the closest to what you think about the question. And yet we will have to understand it'll never be 100% accurate because there's just too much to reality to express in words.
Well, exactly, and that's the point. You're right.
Yeah. But there is one benefit to this, George. The one good thing about since we have misunderstandings sometimes and we never fully understand what people mean just when they've spoken a sentence, that means we get to go on talking the rest of our lives to each other and learning to understand one another better.
Oh, yeah, and I would imagine as each decade goes by, there's got to be some, greater and greater uniformity in our understanding. I mean, like, some concepts I think we may take perhaps centuries to achieve a universal uniformity, but I imagine we're going in the direction of like, of reaching a more accurate understanding of everything that we all hold.
Yeah. And one thing that's really cool, George, is I tend to think that people having discussions, sometimes it's just friendly conversations, sometimes it gets into debate that tend to get a little bit wild, like when it got to the theories of time thing with our ghost recently. But the main thing is to keep communicating. That's the main thing. Because as soon as somebody just says, well, this is the way it is, and I'm not going to be your friend if you disagree, well, then that creates all sorts of problems because then people don't talk. They understand each other less and less over time as they change. And then it just leads to, yeah, it just leads to bigger conflict.
Yeah, and Chandler, I think that's why work on free will is so important. To the extent we abandon it, we evolve beyond it. We don't judge others as harshly. We're a lot more understanding of others, and that helps us preserve our relationships and hence our communication.
Yeah, absolutely does. Yeah, we've talked about a lot, and so I guess we probably should end this soon. But this has been a really good talk, George, and I hope that I understand the distinction. But I guess I can listen to you explain it again with this recording between the pantheism accutheism distinction. So,
Sounds
all right. So, should I end it now?
sounds good.
Okay. You've been listening to Impersonal Opinion, the podcast where we don't take our opinions personally. And hopefully, after listening to that conversation between George and I, you'll understand part of the reasons, some of the reasons why we should not take our opinions personally. Because it stops us from communicating, and then all sorts of other problems can't be solved because we can't communicate. So, hope you found this educational and entertaining. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.